Her scream had no sound left in it, just a raw, ragged gasp against the desert heat. The sun beat down on Evelyn's swollen belly, a cruel hammer against an anvil. Ropes dug into her wrists, biting through skin that was already raw. Her lips were cracked and bleeding. Her legs, shaking under the weight of the 8-month life inside her, threatened to give out completely. And the man who should have been protecting her? The one who swore an oath before God? He stood just a few feet away, watching, just watching her suffer. Carl spat a brown stream of tobacco into the dirt. His voice was cold, like iron left out in a winter frost. "You think that child is mine?" Everyone in town knew, he snarled. They all whispered it. The doctor himself had said it, right after the horse threw him, right after the animal's weight had crushed something vital inside him. "You carry another man's seed, Evelyn. Not mine." He turned his back on her then. Turned his back like she was nothing more than a broken-down mare tied to a post. A useless animal. Evelyn tried to form words, but her throat was sandpaper. She forced them out, a dry, trembling whisper. "Please, Carl, take them off. I beg you." Her plea was met with the one thing more cruel than his words. Silence. Carl just leaned against the wooden rail of the corral, taking a long, slow sip from a tin cup. He was letting her roast, letting the sun do his dirty work. Her body screamed for water, her mind begged for an ounce of mercy, but his eyes held nothing but pure, unyielding contempt. This wasn't the first time, not by a long shot. For months now, bruises had bloomed across her skin like ugly purple flowers. She kept them hidden beneath the high collars and long sleeves of her dresses, a secret garden of his cruelty that no one in town was allowed to see. But today was different. Today, Carl had gone further. He didn't want to hide his work. He wanted the whole world to see her humiliation. He wanted to break her, piece by painful piece, right out in the open. Evelyn's knees finally buckled. She collapsed against the rough wood of the post, her cheek pressing into the splinters. The rope burned, tightening its grip as her weight pulled against it. She thought of the child inside her, a life that had been so active just that morning, now terrifyingly still and silent. A cold spear of fear stabbed through her chest. If she gave up now, if her body failed her here under this hateful sun, her baby would never even see the light of day. A buzzard circled high above, a patient black speck against the burning blue sky. It was just waiting for her to stop moving, waiting for the end. Evelyn tried to scream again, a real scream this time, one that might carry across the plains. But her voice was gone. Only a desperate whisper escaped her lips. "Please, someone, please." But there was no one. The ranch hands had all made themselves scarce hours ago. They were good men, mostly, but not good enough to cross Carl's wrath. The neighbors, if they heard anything at all, stayed behind their fences, pretending to be deaf. Everyone knew Carl was a dangerous man. His temper was short, his fist was fast, and he'd grown more and more paranoid ever since the whispers about his injury started spreading through town like a prairie fire. The men in the saloon mocked his weakness in hushed tones over cheap whiskey. The women in church avoided his sharp, angry gaze. And Evelyn, his wife, she carried the full, crushing weight of his shame. The child she bore wasn't proof of betrayal. It was proof of his failure as a man. In Carl's twisted mind, it was the ultimate mark of humiliation. And for that, he would make her pay. The sun climbed higher. Evelyn's vision started to blur at the edges, the world dissolving into a shimmering haze. Her body begged for rest, begged for the cool darkness of surrender. But her spirit, a stubborn, flickering flame, refused to be extinguished. She thought of her mother's voice, a soft and steady memory from long ago, telling her that hope was the last thing a person should ever let go of. She clung to that thought like a drowning soul clinging to a piece of driftwood. Her wrists were bleeding freely now, the dark red staining the dusty rope. Inside her, her belly shifted. A faint, weak kick. It was a tiny flutter, but it was enough. It was a reminder that she was not alone in this fight. Tears blurred her vision, mixing with the sweat and the dust on her cheeks. She whispered to the child, a silent promise. "Hold on. Please, just hold on." And then, something changed. A plume of dust rose in the distance, the rhythmic pounding of hooves against the hard-packed earth. A rider. A lone rider was approaching, his outline a dark silhouette against the blinding horizon. Evelyn blinked, trying to clear the sun from her eyes. Her heart began to pound a frantic rhythm against her ribs, a drumbeat of both terror and a wild, fragile hope. Was it another tormentor? Another one of Carl's friends coming to watch the show? Or was it something else? A hand, finally, willing to cut her free? The rider drew closer, his shadow stretching long and dark across the dirt. And for the first time all day, Carl shifted. He stood up straight, his smug confidence flickering for just a second, replaced by something darker, something that looked almost like concern. Who was this man on horseback? And why did his silent approach make a cruel man like Carl finally falter? The rider came closer still, and through the haze of heat and tears, Evelyn could finally make out his face. He was an older man, maybe near 60, with lines carved deep into his skin from a lifetime spent under this same unforgiving sun. His eyes were steady, not cruel like Carl's, but sharp. Sharp like a man who had seen enough of life to know instantly when something was terribly, terribly wrong. Carl spat again, a nervous, angry gesture meant to look fearless, but there was a little twitch in his jaw that betrayed him. "What do you want, old man? This is my wife. My land. Keep riding." The rider, Thomas Grady, did not keep riding. He swung down from his horse with the easy grace of a man half his age, his worn boots sinking into the dry, cracked dirt. He walked straight toward Evelyn, his eyes never leaving her broken form. Carl moved fast, trying to block his path, shoving the old man back. "You touch her, and you'll regret it." Thomas didn't even flinch. He just looked past Carl, at Evelyn. He saw the rope biting into her flesh, saw the impossible swell of her belly rising and falling with each pained breath, and something cold and hard flickered in his gaze. "Let her go," he said. His voice was calm, but it was a calm that carried the weight of a coming storm. Carl laughed, a harsh, ugly sound, but it was the laugh of a man who was already losing his nerve. "You think that child is mine? Everyone in town knows it ain't. The doc himself said I was finished after that horse crushed me. She's carrying another man's brat. That's all she is." The words hung in the hot, still air, heavy and cruel. Evelyn turned her face away, shame and tears mixing with the dust on her skin. She expected the stranger to look at her with the same judgment, the same disgust as everyone else. But Thomas didn't. He stepped closer, right up to Carl, his quiet presence suddenly more intimidating than all of Carl's loud-mouthed rage. "When you raise a hand to a woman carrying life," Thomas said, his voice low and dangerous, "you stop being a man in my eyes." That was all it took. Carl lunged, his fists swinging wild and clumsy, fueled by pure, desperate fury. The fight was quick, but it was hard. Carl was younger, stronger, his rage giving him a brutal energy. But Thomas had fought before. You could see it in the way he moved, in the calm, measured way he met the attack. He'd fought in saloons, in barns, maybe even in wars that people didn't speak of anymore. Each blow he landed wasn't just about strength. It came with the solid weight of years, steady and sharp and precise. Carl stumbled, his nose suddenly bloody. He tried to swing again, but one final, perfectly placed punch from Thomas sent him sprawling into the dirt, gasping for air like a landed fish. Thomas stood over him, his chest heaving slightly, but his eyes were as steady as stone. "You don't own her anymore," he said, the words an epitaph for Carl's reign of terror. "You never did." He turned, pulling a knife from his belt. With a single, swift motion, he cut the ropes. He lifted Evelyn into his arms as if she weighed nothing at all and carried her to his horse. Evelyn clung weakly to his dusty shirt, the smell of leather and sweat filling her lungs. And for the first time in months, maybe even years, she felt a single fragile flicker of something she'd almost forgotten. She felt safe. Carl was still on the ground, cursing and spitting threats, but he was too broken to get up. Thomas swung into the saddle, settling Evelyn carefully in front of him, holding her close. The horse took off, its hooves pounding a rhythm of escape against the hard earth, leaving Carl behind in a cloud of dust, and his own bitter hatred. At the ranch, Thomas laid her gently on a clean, soft bed. He fetched a basin of cool water and gently wiped the blood and grime from her wrists. "You're safe now," he said softly, and though his voice still carried that edge of steel, it was tempered with a kindness she hadn't known in a very long time. Evelyn closed her eyes, relief washing over her in a powerful wave. But even as her body began to relax, her mind replayed Carl's hateful words. If Carl was right, if he truly couldn't father a child, then who in this town would ever believe her? Would they see her as a victim, finally freed from a monster? Or would they see her as a liar, a fallen woman who got what she deserved? And a more chilling thought followed. How long before Carl got back on his feet? How long before he came looking for her? For the first time in months, Evelyn slept without fear. The sheets smelled of soap and sunshine. The room was quiet, peaceful, with only the gentle creak of wood in the old ranch house to break the silence. Thomas checked on her more than once that night, a silent guardian. He left a cup of fresh water by the bed and kept a lantern burning low in the main room, a small beacon against the dark just in case she woke. By morning, a little color had returned to her cheeks. She managed to sit up to drink the broth he offered. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice still weak, but more alive than it had been in a long, long time. Thomas only nodded, his expression unreadable. "You're safe here. Rest up. I'll need to ride into town for some supplies." The old man saddled his horse and left for the town of Dry Creek. He figured a few hours away would do no harm. He was wrong, because safety in the West never lasted long, and a man like Carl didn't just disappear. He was bruised, his pride was shattered, but he was boiling with a rage that was hotter than the desert sun. He waited. He watched from a distance, hidden among the rocks and mesquite, until he saw Thomas ride away. Then he slipped onto the quiet ranch like a rattlesnake gliding through the tall grass. Evelyn was sitting at the small wooden table, slowly sipping the last of her broth, when the door swung open with a violent crash. Her heart didn't just drop. It stopped cold. Carl filled the doorway, his face a swollen purple mask of pure fury. His eyes were burning with a terrifying madness. "You thought you could run from me?" he hissed, stalking into the room. "You thought an old fool like him could keep you safe?" Evelyn scrambled to stand to get away, but he was too fast. He struck her across the face with the back of his hand, a brutal blow that sent her crashing to the floor. He grabbed a fistful of her long hair, yanking her head back with a vicious twist. "You're mine!" he screamed, his face inches from hers, his breath hot and foul. "Do you hear me? That bastard child you're carrying won't save you!" He began to drag her by her hair out of the house and toward the barn. She kicked and fought, but she was weak, and he was fueled by a terrifying strength. He was a man possessed. "You're coming back where you belong," he snarled, pulling her through the dust. He dragged her into an empty stall, the air thick with the smell of hay and manure. He tied her hands once again, pulling the rope tight with the same cruel, practiced knot as before. Dust filled her lungs, making her choke. She hit the ground hard, and a sharp, terrifying pain shot through her belly. Carl's madness was in every word, every move. He wasn't just angry anymore. He was unhinged. You think the town will believe you over me? They all know. They all whisper about you. That baby isn't mine. You shamed me, Evelyn. Now you'll pay. He stood over her, his shadow falling across her like a shroud. She bit back a sob, a desperate prayer forming in her mind. A prayer that Thomas would return. A prayer that he hadn't gone too far, that he'd somehow feel that something was wrong. The barn grew silent, the only sound the ragged, terrified whisper of her own breath. And for the second time in as many days, she wondered if this was it. If this was the day that she and her unborn child would finally die. Out on the trail, miles away, Thomas Grady felt a sudden, sharp unease. He couldn't explain it. It was just a feeling in his gut, a cold knot of dread that told him something was wrong. Terribly wrong. He pulled his horse to a halt, the animal sensing his tension. He looked back down the trail, back toward the ranch. It was just a feeling, but he'd lived long enough to learn to trust his gut. The old man didn't hesitate. He wheeled his horse around, urging it into a gallop, dust rising in a cloud behind him. The ranch was still miles away, and back in that dark, dusty barn, Evelyn whispered one last, desperate plea through the ropes that bound her. Please, God, send him back. Send him back before it's too late. But this time, when Thomas Grady came back, he wouldn't be riding back with just his fists. This time he was riding back with a gun. The ranch house was empty when Thomas rode in, his horse lathered and breathing hard. The front door was swinging on its hinges. A chair was overturned. A bowl of broth was shattered on the floorboards. The bed where Evelyn had been resting was empty, the blankets thrown aside. His gut twisted into a tight, cold knot. He knew. He knew Carl had been here. Thomas stormed back outside, his eyes scanning the ground like a tracker. He saw them immediately, fresh hoof prints, deep and hurried, cutting through the dirt, and the smaller, scuffed tracks of a person being dragged. He followed them, his jaw clenched so tight it ached. His horse, sensing the urgency, pounded across the open field, eating up the distance to Carl's property. The old man's face was a grim mask. He prayed he wasn't too late. In the barn on Carl's land, Evelyn lay tied in the dirt of the stall. Her face was bruised and swollen, her dress was torn. A sharp, rhythmic pain was now tightening in her belly, a terrifying premonition of what was to come. Carl was circling her like a vulture, muttering to himself, his mind clearly broken. You thought you could shame me, thought you could hide behind him, but nobody takes what's mine. Nobody. The barn door slammed open with such force that it shuddered on its hinges. Thomas filled the frame, a dark, avenging silhouette against the bright sun. His revolver was in his hand, steady, and aimed right at Carl's chest. Step away from her, Carl. For the first time, Carl seemed to truly hesitate. This was not the same tired old rancher from the day before. There was a fire in Thomas's eyes now, a righteous fury that was terrifying to behold. His voice cut through the dusty air like a shard of steel. You've had your last chance, Carl sneered, but his swagger was gone, replaced by the frantic fear of a cornered animal. You won't shoot me, old man. You ain't got it in you. Thomas cocked the hammer of the gun. The sound, a single sharp click, echoed in the silent barn. It was the deadliest sound in the world. Try me. Carl froze, a bead of sweat rolling down his temple. He believed him. Evelyn's eyes, wide with a mixture of terror and hope, filled with tears as she looked at Thomas. He moved slowly, deliberately, never taking his eyes or the barrel of his gun off Carl. He knelt and, with his free hand, cut the ropes from Evelyn's wrists. She collapsed into his arms, her body shaking uncontrollably, but he held her steady. He helped her to her feet, positioning himself between her and Carl. Then he turned the barrel back on the man cowering in the corner. "You're walking into town with me. The law can finish what I started." But as Thomas marched him out of the barn, Carl started to laugh, a strange, unhinged cackle. "You think this is about the baby, old man?" he spat, his eyes wild. "You think this is about my pride? You have no idea what she's done. No idea at all." Thomas shoved him forward with the barrel of the revolver. "Keep walking." "She stole from me!" Carl screamed, his voice cracking. "It wasn't another man, you old fool. It was a business partner. She helped him rob me blind, and then she ran. I wasn't punishing her for a baby. I was trying to get back what's mine. That baby is just her excuse." The words hit Thomas with the force of a physical blow. He glanced back at Evelyn, who was shaking her head, tears streaming down her face. Was it possible? Was this whole nightmare built on an even darker secret? He couldn't afford to believe the ravings of a madman. He shoved Carl again, harder this time. "Shut your mouth and walk." By the time they reached the dusty main street of Dry Creek, half the town had gathered to watch the strange procession. The sheriff, a heavy-set man named Brody with a lazy mustache, stepped out of his office, his hands resting on his belt. Thomas shoved Carl forward, his voice ringing out for all to hear. "This man beat his wife, Sheriff. Nearly killed her and the child she carries. I won't see him walk free another day." Sheriff Brody nodded slowly, his eyes taking in the scene. He took Carl by the arm, and for a moment it seemed like justice would be served. Evelyn stood in the small crowd, her face pale, her hands resting protectively on her belly. The whispers spread like wildfire. Now everyone could see the bruises, the torn dress, the truth written all over Carl's snarling face. He was no victim. He was a monster who had finally been cornered. The sheriff snapped the cuffs closed. The iron clink was loud and final, a sound that should have brought relief. Carl shouted and cursed, but no one moved to help him. He was finished. And yet, as the sheriff dragged him away into the dark jailhouse, Evelyn felt a cold shiver run down her spine. The sheriff hadn't looked at Carl with contempt. He'd looked at him with something that almost seemed like pity. And Carl's strange, desperate words echoed in her mind. Was this truly the end of her suffering, or was it just the beginning of a whole new nightmare? The days that followed were quiet. Deceptively quiet. Carl was gone, locked away by the sheriff, and Thomas's ranch finally felt like a sanctuary. Evelyn began to heal, the bruises on her skin fading even as the scars on her spirit remained. Thomas stayed by her side, a silent, steady presence. He didn't ask questions about what Carl had said. He didn't demand answers. He simply offered her what she had been denied for so long: kindness, patience, and a safe place to rest. The nights were still long, and sometimes the fear would wake her in a cold sweat. But every time she opened her eyes, she would see him, sitting in the worn armchair by her bed, his hat resting on his knee, just waiting, a silent guardian angel in dusty denim. One evening, there was a knock at the door. It was Sheriff Brody. He tipped his hat to Evelyn, but his eyes were on Thomas. "Grady," he said, his voice low. "Can I have a word?" The two men stepped outside, into the fading light of dusk. Evelyn watched them through the small window, a knot of anxiety tightening in her stomach. Brody was talking, gesturing back toward town. Thomas stood perfectly still, listening, his face carved from stone. When he came back inside, the look on his face sent a fresh wave of fear through her. "What is it?" she whispered. Thomas took a long breath. "That was the sheriff. He wasn't here to check on us. He was here with a warning. He said Carl's family is powerful, rich ranchers from back east. They've sent a lawyer. They're not going to let this go." He paused, his gaze heavy. And they know who I am. He said to tell Thomas Grady to mind his own business. The name hung in the air. Not just Thomas. Thomas Grady. It was a name with a history. A name that meant something. Evelyn realized in that moment that she knew nothing about the man who had saved her life. He was a stranger, a kind one, a brave one, but a stranger nonetheless, and his past was now coming for them both. "Who are you, Thomas?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He looked away toward the small, tightly shut door of a room at the back of the house, a room she had never seen open. "I'm just a man who's seen this story before," he said, his voice thick with an old, deep sorrow. He walked to the door and, for the first time, turned the key in the lock. He pushed it open. Inside, it was a child's bedroom, a girl's room. It was perfectly preserved, as if its owner had just stepped out for a moment. A small rocking horse stood in the corner. A handmade doll lay on the neatly made bed. But a thick layer of dust covered everything, a testament to years of silent grief. "This was my daughter's room," Thomas said, his voice cracking. "Her name was Sarah." He explained that years ago Sarah had married a man, a cruel man, full of charm on the outside and pure poison on the inside. He took everything from her, her joy, her spirit, her money. One day, she ran. She just disappeared, leaving a note saying she couldn't take it anymore. Thomas had spent years searching, following every rumor, every ghost of a lead, but he never found her. "The day I saw you," he said, his eyes filled with a profound sadness, "tied to that post. You had the same look in your eyes, the same look I imagined in hers. I couldn't just ride by. I couldn't let it happen again." The story was heartbreaking, but it raised a terrifying question. If this was just about his daughter, if this was just a coincidence, then what did Carl's family want? Why was his name, Thomas Grady, a warning? The answer arrived 2 days later, in the form of a well-dressed man in a city suit, riding in a polished black buggy that looked completely out of place in the dusty town of Dry Creek. He wasn't looking for Thomas, and he wasn't looking for Carl. He was looking for Evelyn. His name was Mr. Blackwood, and he was a lawyer from St. Louis. He informed Evelyn that her estranged father, a man she hadn't seen since she was a little girl, had passed away. He had been a quiet man who had amassed a surprising fortune in mining, and he had left it all to her. A wave of shock and disbelief washed over Evelyn. But then came the condition, the catch. The entire inheritance, a fortune that could change her life forever, was left to her and her child. But there was a clause, written in stark black ink. The child had to be proven to be of her late husband's bloodline. Suddenly, everything clicked into place with horrifying clarity. Carl knew. He must have known about her father's wealth. His cruelty wasn't just about his wounded pride. It was about money. He was trying to control her, to control the baby, to control the inheritance. His public declaration that the child wasn't his was a tool of torture, a way to isolate her and break her spirit. But now, that lie had backfired. If the whole town believed him, if he had sworn the child wasn't his, then he had no claim to the fortune. He had, in his own fit of rage, cut himself off from the very thing he desired most. Or so she thought. The very next day, a rumor started to spread through town, a rumor that started in the saloon and was whispered over fences and in the general store. The rumor was that Carl had confessed. He'd told Sheriff Brody that he had lied. He'd only said the baby wasn't his because he was hurt and angry. Of course, the baby was his, and he wanted his wife and his child back. It was a brilliant, wicked move. He was painting himself as the wronged husband, lashing out in pain, now ready to forgive and forget. He was repositioning himself to claim both his wife and her fortune, and the whole town, eager for gossip and drama, was starting to believe him. Evelyn felt the trap closing around her. Carl's word against hers, a man's word against a woman's. In a town like Dry Creek, she knew who they would believe. There was only one person who could cut through the lies, one person who could tell the truth about Carl's infamous injury: the doctor. Her hands trembling, Evelyn walked into town alone. She found the doctor in his small, cluttered office. He looked up, his face pale and nervous when he saw her. "Doctor," she said, her voice steady despite the fear churning in her stomach. "You told Carl he couldn't have children after his accident. I need you to tell the sheriff the truth." The doctor wrung his hands, refusing to meet her eyes. "My dear, I can't. Patient confidentiality." "This isn't about confidentiality," Evelyn pressed, her voice rising. "This is about a lie that has nearly gotten me and my baby killed. Did the horse crush him, doctor? Or was that just a story he paid you to tell?" The doctor's face crumpled. He finally looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and shame. He paid me," he stammered, the words tumbling out in a rush. "The accident was real. He was banged up bad, but it didn't do what he claimed it did. He's perfectly capable of fathering a child. He wanted an excuse. A way to control you," he said. "A way to disown the baby if it was a girl. I never thought he'd go this far." The confession was a bombshell. The entire foundation of her torment, the core truth that had defined her life for the past year, was a calculated, vicious lie. Carl had invented his own shame, weaponized it, and used it to torture her. Armed with this new, explosive truth, Evelyn went straight to the sheriff's office. But when she got there, the door was wide open. The cell was empty. A deputy stood there, looking flustered. "He's gone," the young man said, shaking his head. "Sheriff Brody came in an hour ago, said he had a transfer order, said Carl's family had arranged to have him moved to a federal prison. He just took him and left." Evelyn's blood ran cold. There was no transfer order. There was no federal prison. Sheriff Brody, bought and paid for by Carl's family, had just let him walk out the front door. And now, Carl was free. He was armed with a new lie, convinced a fortune was within his grasp, and coming back for her. And this time, he wouldn't just be looking for revenge. He'd be looking to claim his prize. The quiet on the ranch was over. The storm was about to break. Thomas didn't waste a second. When Evelyn returned with the news, his face became a grim, determined mask. "He'll come here," he said, his voice low and certain. "He's not just a brute anymore. He's a desperate man with a fortune to gain. He'll have friends this time." They worked through the afternoon, a silent, frantic preparation for a war they both knew was coming. Thomas boarded up the lower windows, leaving just enough space to see out and shoot through. He checked his rifle, his revolver, laying out boxes of cartridges on the kitchen table. Evelyn gathered blankets, filled every bucket and pot with water, and moved what little food they had into the main room, turning the small ranch house into a makeshift fortress. The air was thick with unspoken fear, with the heavy tension of the coming night. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and red, they saw them. 4 riders, dark silhouettes against the dying light, approaching the ranch slowly, deliberately. Carl was at their head. "Get down," Thomas whispered, pushing Evelyn away from the window. He moved to his position, rifle resting on the sill. The house fell silent, the only sound the frantic beating of Evelyn's heart. The riders stopped just out of rifle range. Carl's voice cut through the twilight, amplified by the vast open space. "Evelyn! You hear me? I'm coming for what's mine, my wife, my child, and my money. You and that old man can't stop me." Thomas didn't answer. He just waited, his breathing slow and steady, his finger resting lightly on the trigger. "Give her up, Grady," one of the other men shouted. "We don't have no quarrel with you." "You've got one now," Thomas muttered under his breath. The standoff stretched for what felt like an eternity. The sky darkened from purple to a deep inky black, pricked with the cold light of 1,000 stars. Then, a gunshot shattered the silence. A bullet splintered the wood of the window frame just inches from Thomas's head. The siege had begun. For hours they traded shots in the dark. The hired guns were reckless, firing wildly at the house, their muzzle flashes lighting up the night like angry fireflies. Thomas was patient. He fired sparingly, each shot carefully aimed, making them think twice about getting any closer. Inside the house, the air was thick with the smell of gunpowder and fear. Evelyn huddled on the floor, her hands wrapped around her belly, trying to make herself as small as possible. And then, a new, terrifying sensation. A sharp, undeniable pain gripped her, squeezing the air from her lungs. Her water broke. "Thomas!" she gasped, her voice tight with panic. "The baby! It's coming!" Thomas glanced back at her, his face illuminated for a split second by the flash of his own rifle. The grim determination in his eyes was now mixed with a new, frantic urgency. He was trapped, forced to fight off 4 armed men while helping to bring a new life into this world of violence. The chaos escalated. The pains came faster, harder. Evelyn's cries mixed with the roar of gunfire. Thomas was a whirlwind of motion, firing a shot, then rushing to her side, offering a word of encouragement, a hand to squeeze before turning back to the window to return fire. It was an impossible, desperate dance of life and death. A bullet ripped through the thin wall, tearing through a sack of flour, sending a white cloud billowing into the room. One of the men was trying to get to the back door. Thomas fired twice, and a scream from outside told him he'd found his mark, but there were still 3 more, and they were getting closer. Evelyn screamed, a raw, primal sound as another contraction seized her. The baby was coming now. There was no stopping it. Carl, hearing her cries, let out a triumphant roar from the darkness. "That's it, Evelyn! Bring my son into the world! Bring me my fortune!" His words fueled a new fire in her, a rage that burned away the fear. This was not his son. This was not his fortune. This child would never, ever be in the hands of that monster. One of the hired guns managed to kick in the back door, his form silhouetted in the doorway, revolver raised. Thomas was at the front window, pinned down. It was over, but it wasn't. In a moment of pure adrenaline-fueled strength, Evelyn grabbed the only thing she could reach, a heavy cast-iron skillet left near the hearth. As the man stepped into the room, his eyes adjusting to the dark, she swung it with all her might. The heavy iron connected with the side of his head with a sickening thud. He dropped like a stone, unconscious before he hit the floor. Thomas turned, his eyes wide with shock and admiration. But there was no time. Another man was coming through the broken door. Thomas raised his rifle and fired. The man fell backward, out into the night. Now it was just one. Just Carl. The shooting stopped. The silence that fell was more terrifying than the noise. Where was he? He was already inside. He came from the shadows of the other room, his face a mask of sweat and dirt, his eyes wild with greed. He saw the unconscious man on the floor, the dead one outside. He saw Evelyn panting on the floor, clearly in the final stages of labor. And he saw Thomas, his rifle empty. "It's over, old man," Carl snarled, raising his pistol. But he wasn't aiming at Thomas. He was aiming at Evelyn. "The money's mine," he hissed. Thomas lunged, a desperate sacrificial move to knock the gun away, but Carl was faster, sidestepping and bringing the butt of his pistol down hard on Thomas's head. The old man crumpled to the floor, stunned. Carl stood over Evelyn, the gun now pointed directly at her swollen belly. "It all ends now," he whispered, his finger tightening on the trigger. Evelyn gave one final powerful push, a scream of effort and defiance tearing from her throat. And at that exact moment, the cry of a newborn baby filled the small, violent room. A boy. He was here. The sound, so pure and new, seemed to shock Carl, making him hesitate for just a fraction of a second. It was all the time Thomas needed. With a groan, he surged up from the floor, not like an old man, but like a wounded grizzly bear. He tackled Carl, sending them both crashing into the wall. The gun went off, the shot going harmlessly into the ceiling. They fought, a brutal, desperate struggle in the dimly lit room. It wasn't a fight of skill anymore. It was a fight of pure will. Thomas was old, injured, but he was fighting for more than his life. He was fighting for the future, for the tiny crying baby on the floor. Carl was fighting for greed, for a fortune he felt he was owed. In the end, it was no contest. Thomas, fueled by a righteous fury, got the upper hand. He slammed Carl's head against the floorboards again and again until the man finally went limp. Silence descended. The only sounds were the soft crackle of the fire, the ragged gasps of Thomas's breath, and the beautiful, insistent cries of a brand-new baby boy. The fight was over. Justice, it seemed, had finally been served. But the biggest revelation of all was yet to come. In the quiet aftermath, with Carl and his men tied up and the first light of dawn creeping over the horizon, Thomas helped Evelyn clean the newborn baby. He wrapped the boy in a soft blanket and handed him to his mother. As she held her son for the first time, a small, tarnished silver locket that she always wore around her neck slipped out from under her dress. Thomas's eyes fixed on it. It was old, intricately carved. "That's a beautiful locket," he said, his voice hoarse. "It was my mother's," Evelyn whispered, her eyes never leaving her baby's face. "May I?" Thomas asked, his hand trembling slightly as he reached for it. Evelyn nodded. He took the small silver oval in his rough, calloused hands and carefully pried it open. Inside there was a tiny, faded portrait of a young woman, a woman with Evelyn's smile and kind, gentle eyes. Thomas froze. His breath hitched in his chest. His face went pale. Slowly, he reached into his own shirt and pulled out a chain. On the end of it was another locket, an identical twin to the one in his hand. With shaking fingers, he opened his. Inside was a portrait of the same woman. "Sarah," he breathed, the name a ghost on his lips. Evelyn looked up, confused. "Who's Sarah?" Tears were streaming down the old man's face now, carving clean paths through the grime and blood. "My daughter," he whispered, his voice choked with an emotion too vast to comprehend. "My long-lost daughter, Evelyn, that woman, your mother, was my Sarah." The truth hit them with the force of a physical blow. Evelyn's mother, Sarah, had run away from her cruel first husband, a man whose name Evelyn had never known. She had changed her name, started a new life, and married Evelyn's father. She had died young, taking her secrets with her, never telling anyone about the family she'd left behind. Thomas wasn't just a kind stranger who had stumbled into her life. He wasn't just a guardian angel. He was her grandfather. He hadn't just been saving a woman who reminded him of his daughter. He had, without ever knowing it, been saving his own blood. The baby boy, now sleeping peacefully in his mother's arms, was his great-grandson. When Sheriff Brody finally rode out to the ranch later that day, guided by a neighbor who'd heard the shots, he found a scene of resolved chaos. He saw the defeated men tied up. He saw Carl, bruised and broken, and he saw the new family, forged in fire and blood, huddled together. Brody, a man who always knew which way the wind was blowing, saw the truth. He saw the end of Carl's power and the beginning of something new. He arrested Carl for good this time, knowing that his wealthy family could no longer protect him from charges of attempted murder. The inheritance was secured. The ranch was no longer just a sanctuary. It was a home, filled with the ghosts of the past and the promise of a future. Thomas Grady, who had lost his entire family, had found them again in the most impossible of circumstances. And Evelyn, who had thought she was all alone in the world, had found a protector, a grandfather, and a future she never could have dreamed of. Cruelty, you see, may win for a season, but it can't outlive love. Violence can shout, but it can never silence the steady, quiet strength of family. The West was full of men like Carl, but it was also built by men and women like Thomas and Evelyn, who proved that true strength isn't in your fist, but in the family you fight to protect. And that brings up a question worth asking. What would you have done in Thomas's boots? Would you have just kept riding? Let us know in the comments below. If this story of justice and unexpected family touched your heart, please give this video a like. It really helps more people find these hidden tales from the frontier. And if you want to hear more stories of courage, redemption, and the unbreakable bonds of family, make sure you hit that subscribe button so you never miss the next chapter with us.